March 15th, 2019, a Tuesday morning. At a logistics company in Dallas, Texas, the HR manager noticed something strange. An employee hadn't shown up for work in 3 days. No call, no text, no explanation. Just gone. The manager pulled up the employee's file. Sarah Martinez, age 32. Hired 6 months ago. Clean background check. Valid driver's license. Social security number verified. 3 professional references. Performance reviews were good. Paychecks deposited regularly into her bank account. The manager called the phone number on file. Disconnected. Tried the emergency contact. Number didn't exist. Visited the home address listed in the system. It was a UPS store mailbox. That's when they called the police. And that's when they discovered something impossible. Sarah Martinez didn't exist. Never had. The social security number was real, but it had been issued 3 years ago to someone with no employment history, no tax returns, no credit history before that. The driver's license was legitimate, obtained with documents that checked out but led nowhere. The references? Phone numbers that went to voicemail boxes set up specifically to give glowing recommendations. The background check? Passed, because there was nothing negative to find. Because Sarah Martinez had been created from nothing. A completely fabricated identity, with real credentials, real documentation, real work history. And over 6 months, Sarah had collected $78,000 in salary. Money deposited into a real bank account. Then transferred out. Gone. But Sarah Martinez wasn't alone. When investigators started digging, they found more. Dozens more. Across multiple companies. Different names. Different faces. All fake. All collecting paychecks. All disappearing. By the time the FBI finished their investigation, they'd discovered over 50,000 phantom workers. Synthetic identities created by organized criminal networks. People who existed on paper, who got jobs, who received salaries, who obtained loans and credit cards, but who weren't real, had never been real, were ghosts in the system. And they'd stolen over $2.5 billion before anyone realized the workers collecting paychecks didn't actually exist. This is the story of the greatest identity fraud in history. Not stolen identities, fabricated ones. This is the story of the phantom workers. To understand synthetic identity fraud, you need to understand how identity works in America, how we prove we're real, and how criminals found a way to create people from nothing. Traditional identity theft is straightforward. A criminal steals your social security number, your personal information, uses it to open accounts or make purchases. You're the victim. The fraud is traced back to your identity. Eventually, it gets discovered and stopped. But synthetic identity fraud is different. Instead of stealing an identity, criminals create one. They start with a real social security number, usually one that hasn't been used yet, often belonging to a child, or someone who recently died, or just unused. They pair that number with a fake name, fake birth date, fake address. This combination doesn't match anyone real. It's new, fabricated, synthetic. Then comes the crucial part: building credit history, making the synthetic identities seem real. The criminal applies for a secured credit card, puts down a deposit, uses the card carefully, makes small purchases, pays on time. After a few months, the credit card company reports the payment history to credit bureaus. And suddenly, the synthetic identity has a credit score. They open a bank account, make regular deposits, keep the balance positive. The account shows financial stability, responsible money management. They rent an apartment, maybe using a real address, maybe another synthetic identity as a roommate. This creates a residential history, a paper trail showing where they live. Over time, sometimes months, sometimes years, the synthetic identity becomes real. Not a person, but a functional identity, with credit history, bank accounts, addresses, employment records, everything needed to pass background checks, to get jobs, to obtain loans. And here's the disturbing part. This identity can often bypass verification systems, because the information isn't stolen, it's created. And it's designed specifically to look legitimate. Credit bureaus don't verify that the person behind the identity actually exists. They just track the financial behavior associated with that identity. If the behavior looks normal, the identity seems real. Background check companies verify that the information matches across databases. They don't verify the person is real, just that the data is consistent. Employers check references, call the numbers provided, get positive responses. They assume the person exists. Why wouldn't they? Everything checks out. This vulnerability, that our systems verify data consistency but not human existence, is what synthetic identity fraud exploits. And by 2015, criminal organizations had perfected the technique. The scheme that the FBI eventually uncovered wasn't small time. It was organized, sophisticated, international, run by networks that treated synthetic identity creation like a business. Because that's exactly what it was. Here's how it worked. Criminal organizations would create batches of synthetic identities, dozens at a time, each with a unique social security number, name, and backstory. They'd age these identities over years, building credit slowly, creating employment history, making them look like real people with real lives. Then they'd activate them, use the identities to get jobs at companies, usually positions that didn't require in-person interviews, remote work, contract positions, jobs where someone could show up, do minimal work, collect paychecks, and not attract attention. The employees would work for 6 months to 2 years, long enough to collect substantial salary, not long enough to raise suspicion. Then they'd disappear. The bank accounts would be drained, the phone numbers disconnected, the addresses abandoned, and the companies would be left with nothing. No way to recover the money, no real person to prosecute, just a paper trail leading to a ghost. But employment wasn't the only target. These synthetic identities were also used to obtain loans, car loans, personal loans, credit cards with high limits. The criminals would make a few payments to establish trust, then max out the credit and vanish. Banks couldn't recover the money because they'd lent to someone who didn't exist, who had no assets to seize, no wages to garnish, no physical person to find. One FBI investigator described it as the perfect crime, because there's no traditional victim. The person whose social security number was used often doesn't know. Children don't monitor their credit. Recently deceased people can't report fraud. And the synthetic identity itself is the criminal's creation. The scale was staggering. The FBI identified networks operating across 30 states. Some had been running for over a decade. They'd created thousands of synthetic identities, placed them in jobs at logistics companies, call centers, retail management, healthcare administration, anywhere they could get hired remotely or with minimal verification. One network alone had created over 5,000 synthetic identities, generated more than $400 million in fraudulent wages and loans. They operated like a corporation, with managers, specialists, different teams handling different aspects of the fraud. One team created the identities, obtained social security numbers, built credit histories, aged the accounts. Another team applied for jobs, conducted phone interviews using voice actors, submitted fabricated resumes with fake work history, provided references that all led to the same criminal network. A third team managed the employment, showed up for virtual meetings, completed minimal work, made sure the employees didn't raise red flags, collected paychecks, and a final team extracted the money, transferred funds from bank accounts, moved money through cryptocurrency, laundered it through international transactions, made it disappear into the global financial system. The networks were sophisticated enough to handle technical questions during interviews. They'd researched the company's hiring, understood the job requirements, could fake competence long enough to get hired, then relied on the dysfunction of many workplaces, where remote employees can be invisible, to avoid detection. The scheme started unraveling in 2018, not because of law enforcement, not because of corporate security, but because of a single HR manager in Memphis who noticed something odd. 3 employees in her company had the same birthday, not the same year, the same date and month, February 29th, Leap Day. She thought it was a funny coincidence, sent them birthday cards, but one of them never responded, never acknowledged the card, never came to the office party. So she checked his personnel file. Everything looked normal. But something bothered her. She couldn't articulate what. Just a feeling. She did something unusual. She Google searched the employee's name combined with the company's name. Found nothing. Searched his name alone. Found a LinkedIn profile. But the photo didn't match the driver's license on file. Different person, same name. She called the phone number, got voicemail, left a message, no response. Drove to the home address. It was an apartment complex. But the manager said no one by that name lived there, never had. That's when she contacted her company's security department. They investigated, found that the employee's work had been minimal, just enough to avoid attention, that his paychecks had been deposited and immediately transferred out, that his tax withholdings were going to an address in Florida that turned out to be another mailbox. They called the FBI, and the FBI discovered this wasn't an isolated incident. This employee was connected to 47 other synthetic identities working at companies across the South, all created by the same criminal network, all collecting paychecks, all planning to disappear. The investigation expanded rapidly. The FBI formed a task force, started tracking financial transactions, identified patterns, found more synthetic identities, discovered that the problem was far bigger than anyone imagined. Banks started noticing patterns too. Loan applications from people with short credit histories, perfect payment records for a few months, then sudden defaults. The borrowers would disappear, unreachable, untraceable. Credit bureaus realized they had a problem. They'd been reporting credit scores for people who didn't exist. Their systems couldn't distinguish between real people and synthetic identities, because both looked identical in the data. By 2019, the FBI had identified over 50,000 synthetic identities. Not all were used for employment fraud. Some were just for credit fraud, others for benefits fraud, applying for unemployment or welfare using fabricated identities. The total losses exceeded $2.5 billion, and that was just what investigators could document. The actual number was probably higher, because many companies never realized they'd been defrauded. They thought they'd just hired employees who quit without notice, never investigated further. Let me tell you about Detective Maria Chen. She's a financial crimes investigator in Los Angeles, and she spent 3 years chasing a ghost named David Park. David Park had excellent credentials, bachelor's degree in computer science, 3 years of experience, good references. He got hired at a tech startup in LA, remote position, $90,000 a year. For 8 months, David did okay work, not exceptional, not terrible. Attended virtual meetings, completed assignments, never caused problems. Then one day, he stopped responding to emails, missed a deadline, didn't show up to meetings. HR tried to contact him, phone disconnected, email bounced. The emergency contact number was fake. The address was a UPS store. The company reported it to the police. Maria caught the case. She started investigating and discovered David Park's identity was only 3 years old. Before that, nothing. No school records, no previous employment, no social media history older than 36 months. She found the social security number had been issued 3 years ago to someone with no prior history, no parents listed, no birth certificate on file in the state claimed as his birthplace. David Park had been created, fabricated, and the person playing him had collected $72,000 in salary, plus benefits, health insurance that was used for expensive prescriptions, dental work, all billed to the company's insurance. Maria started tracking the money. The paychecks were deposited into a California bank account, then immediately transferred to cryptocurrency exchanges, converted to Bitcoin, moved to international exchanges, cashed out in Eastern Europe. She couldn't trace it further. The money had been laundered through too many transactions, through too many jurisdictions. It was gone. But she kept investigating, because she realized David Park wasn't alone. She found connected identities, similar patterns, same creation dates, same employment strategies, same money laundering techniques. Over 2 years, Maria identified 37 synthetic identities, all created by the same network, all used to defraud California companies. Collectively, they'd stolen over $3 million. She built a case, identified the criminal organization, worked with federal agents, and eventually, they made arrests. Not of David Park, obviously, but of the people who'd created him, who'd played him, who'd stolen in his name. The case went to trial. The defendants were convicted. sentenced to prison. But the money was never recovered, and David Park's identity still exists in databases, in credit reports, in company records, a ghost in the system, permanent evidence of a person who never was. But here's what investigators discovered that made the synthetic identity fraud even more disturbing. Some of the people behind these schemes were real employees at the companies they were defrauding. They'd get legitimate jobs, work normally, then use their access to company systems to create phantom employees, add them to payroll, have paychecks deposited to accounts they controlled. The phantom employees never showed up, never did work, just collected money, while the real employee covered for them, claimed they were remote workers, or contractors, or temporary staff. One case in Chicago involved a payroll manager who created 17 phantom employees over 4 years. She'd add them to the system, process their paychecks, remove them before audits, then add them back. The company paid out over $600,000 before anyone noticed. The manager had access to all the verification systems. She knew what checks would be performed, knew how to make the phantom employees pass those checks, knew how to hide them in the company's bureaucracy. When she was finally caught, because another employee noticed duplicate addresses, she'd already created a network of synthetic identities that extended beyond her company. She'd been selling them to other criminals who used them for credit fraud, employment fraud, benefits fraud. This revealed another dimension of the problem. Synthetic identities are valuable. They can be sold, rented, shared. Criminal marketplaces trade them like commodities. A fully aged synthetic identity with good credit can sell for thousands of dollars. And once created, they can be used repeatedly, for multiple frauds, across multiple years, until they're finally discovered and flagged. But even then, the criminals just create new ones. The cycle continues. Investigators also discovered that some synthetic identities were being used for more than financial fraud. They were used to pass background checks for sensitive positions, to obtain security clearances, to create fake credentials for professionals, nurses, engineers, accountants, whose identities were then used to commit fraud or access restricted systems. One particularly disturbing case involved a synthetic identity used to obtain a nursing license. The person didn't exist, but the license was real, and it was used to access hospital systems, to prescribe medications, to create fake medical records that were then used in insurance fraud schemes. The phantom worker problem exposed fundamental vulnerabilities in how identity works in modern society, and raised questions that remain unresolved. First, how do we verify someone is real? Our systems were built assuming identities represent actual people, that social security numbers connect to births, that credit histories reflect real financial behavior, that employment records document actual work. But synthetic identities break these assumptions. They're real in the system, just not real in reality. And distinguishing between authentic identities and synthetic ones is nearly impossible with current verification methods. Credit bureaus have started implementing detection algorithms, looking for patterns that suggest synthetic identities. But criminals adapt. They age identities longer, make them look more normal, use more sophisticated creation techniques. Background check companies are adding verification steps, but they're limited by privacy laws and data availability. They can't require DNA tests or in-person verification for every job application. Second, who's responsible for the losses? Companies that hired phantom workers lost wages, but they also face legal questions. Did they perform adequate due diligence? Were their hiring practices negligent? Can they write off the losses as fraud, or are they just bad business decisions? Banks that lent to synthetic identities lost money, but they'd approved the loans based on credit scores and financial history that looked legitimate. Were they at fault, or were they victims of sophisticated fraud? The answer varies by jurisdiction and by case. But generally, the losses are absorbed by the companies and banks. They eat the cost, write it off, and implement better verification systems. That inevitably slow down hiring and lending, making the process harder for everyone, including legitimate people. Third, what about the social security numbers? Many synthetic identities use SSNs belonging to children, kids who won't check their credit until they're adults. By then, the synthetic identity has years of history. The child's SSN has been compromised, their credit damaged before they're old enough to vote. The Social Security Administration has limited tools to prevent this. They can't monitor how SSNs are used in real time. They rely on reporting from credit bureaus and employers. By the time they're aware of misuse, the damage is done. Some victims don't discover the fraud until they apply for their first credit card or student loan and find they have bad credit, collections accounts, bankruptcies, all tied to identities they never created. Fourth, the technology gap. Synthetic identity fraud is primarily an American problem because the US relies heavily on Social Security numbers for identity verification. Other countries use different systems: national ID cards with biometrics, centralized databases that verify existence. These systems aren't perfect, but they make synthetic identity creation much harder. The US could implement similar systems, but it would require massive infrastructure changes, privacy concerns, political will, and even then, it wouldn't eliminate the problem, just make it more difficult. March 15th, 2019. An HR manager noticed an employee hadn't shown up for work, started an investigation that revealed the employee didn't exist, had never existed, was a phantom collecting paychecks. That discovery led to the exposure of one of the largest fraud schemes in American history. 50,000 synthetic identities, $2.5 billion stolen, thousands of companies defrauded, all by criminals who created people from nothing. The FBI arrested dozens of individuals, dismantled criminal networks operating across 30 states, shut down operations that had been running for years, but they couldn't recover most of the money, couldn't erase the synthetic identities from databases, couldn't undo the damage to the system. Because the fundamental vulnerability remains. Our identity verification systems still can't reliably distinguish between real people and well-crafted synthetic identities. The methods used to create phantom workers in 2015 still work today. They're just slightly more sophisticated, slightly harder to detect, and new phantom workers are being created right now, getting jobs, collecting paychecks, taking out loans. Some will be discovered quickly. Others will operate for years, until someone notices something odd, until an HR manager asks the right question, until a detective starts pulling threads. Sarah Martinez, the phantom worker from Dallas, was never found because she never existed. The person who created her, who played her, who collected her paychecks, they were never identified. They're still out there, probably running new synthetic identities, new phantom workers, new ghosts in the system. Detective Maria Chen, who spent 3 years chasing David Park, said something that stayed with me. The scariest part isn't that people can create fake identities. It's that those identities become real. They have credit scores, employment history, bank accounts. In every way that matters to our systems, they're real people. Except they're not, and we have no reliable way to tell the difference. This is the world we've built, where data creates reality, where verification means checking data consistency, not human existence, where someone can be simultaneously real and non-existent, real enough to get a job, to open bank accounts, to obtain loans, but not real enough to exist outside databases. The phantom workers exposed this, showed us that identity in the digital age is fragile, constructed, based on assumptions that criminals can exploit. And the cost of that exploitation is billions of dollars, thousands of victims. A system that can't protect itself because it can't see the ghosts operating inside it. Companies are implementing better verification now, using AI to detect patterns, requiring video interviews, checking multiple databases. But each added verification step slows hiring, creates friction, makes legitimate applicants jump through more hoops, and criminals adapt, they always do. They find new ways to create synthetic identities, new methods to age them, new techniques to make them pass verification. It's an arms race between fraud detection and fraud creation. And right now, creation is winning. Somewhere in America, a phantom worker is collecting a paycheck today, working at a company that believes they're real, depositing salary into an account that will soon be emptied, planning to disappear, to join the thousands of ghosts who came before, who stole billions and left nothing but paper trails leading nowhere. The question isn't whether this is happening. It is. The question is, how many? How many phantom workers are operating right now? In how many companies? Collecting how much money? And we don't know, Can't know, because they're ghosts, invisible until they vanish. The phantom workers are still here, still working, still collecting paychecks, still stealing billions. They're real enough to fool our systems, but not real enough to catch. And that is the most disturbing part of all.